What are the disadvantages of using BIOS compatibility mode over Uefi boot? I bought a Samsung Series 9 laptop with 64-bit Windows 8 pre-installed and wish to install Linux, probably Ubuntu 13.04 when it comes out next week, but also considering mid-14. Now there have been multiple reports of firmware problems and laptops bricking up irrevocably when installing Ubuntu when Uefi is enabled. The standard advice seems to be to update the BIOS to the latest version and then disable Uefi mode to reduce the chance of bricking. My questions. What are the disadvantages of doing so? What else do I need to watch out for? If I disable Uefi, do I need the 32 rather than the 64-bit version of Linux?
There are several differences between BIOS mode and Uefi mode booting. On new computers, a BIOS mode boot is likely to take longer than an Uefi mode boot, by a few seconds. Each mode has its own bootloaders and boot managers. In BIOS mode, you've got Lilo, Grub Legacy, Grub2, Berg, SysLinux, and a few others for Linux. In Uefi mode, you've got Elilo, Fedora's patched Grub Legacy, Grub2, the Linux kernel's Uefi stub loader, Refined, Gummiboot, and one or two very exotic bootloaders. See my webpage on the topic for details about these Uefi bootloaders and boot managers. You might have a preference for a specific BIOS only or an Uefi only bootloader. Uefi mode bootloader maintenance is different from BIOS mode bootloader maintenance. Once you know what you're doing, and if your Uefi isn't bug-laden, Uefi bootloader maintenance is easier and more flexible. But most newbies find it harder because they're familiar with the BIOS model and because tools for managing BIOS bootloaders are better integrated into OSes and OS installers than are tools for managing Uefi bootloaders. Uefi mode booting gives you access to Uefi runtime services. Currently, this is pretty minor. They let you manage the boot order from Linux and let the kernel store data in RAM in the event of a kernel panic, but that's about it. In the future, Uefi runtime services may become more important. Uefi provides a boot time environment that can be handy for things like editing bootloader configuration files without booting an OS. Recent Uefis, including those that ship on computers with Windows 8, support secure boot. This is currently more of a hassle than an advantage for Linux users because secure boot support in Linux is still primitive. But it does provide at least a theoretical security advantage because it helps protect against Uefi bootkits. Although not a BIOS disadvantage per se, switching from Uefi mode to BIOS mode requires reinstalling your OSes, or at least reconfiguring their bootloaders, at least, assuming you want to keep anything already installed, Windows if you haven't yet installed anything else. All of these are absolutely trivial compared to the big drawback to Uefi mode booting on Samsung laptops that you've identified. If the Samsung firmware bug is triggered, your new computer will become a useless lump. Concerning the bit width of Linux in Uefi mode, you're best off with the 64-bit version. Although the 32-bit version can work with some hoop jumping, the 64-bit version will be easier to install and will work better. In BIOS mode, either version will work, although I still recommend the 64-bit version because it's likely to be faster, particularly with some types of programs.
I only can address the very last part of your question, and that only anecdotally. But I just installed Ubuntu 12.10 on a new Lenovo laptop that came with 64-bit, Windows 8 and Uefi mode enabled by default. I followed the standard advice of updating the BIOS and then disabling Uefi mode. I had no problems installing the 64-bit version of Ubuntu. So I don't think using the 64-bit version is problematic.
Siesta.